Okay, it's 11:01, so we're going to get started. As a reminder, this is being recorded, so if anyone has to drop off or wasn't able to join, this will be available to watch later. Welcome everyone to a introductory webinar on the Equity Accountability System and Minimum Equity Standard Compliance Plan, and I am noticing that it still says Illinois Shines on the slide. This is specifically for utility scale developers, so apologies for that. I'm Sarah Duffy. I'm Deputy Legal Counsel with Illinois Power Agency, and we're going to be discussing what the equity accountability system means for utility scale developers participating in IPA procurements today. Go ahead to the next slide. Just some housekeeping. We're going to be hearing from myself today, as well as Anthony Starr, who's our Senior Advisor and Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief. We will not be having our cameras on. If anyone has questions, please put them into the chat and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. You can always also send follow-up questions to the procurement administrator or to the IPA directly. Go ahead to the next slide. So we are going to provide an overview of the general framework for equity requirements in IPA programs and how that applies to the procurements of index recs from utility scale projects. We're then going to go into the details of the minimum equity standard and how vendors that receive rec contracts can comply with that requirement. We'll provide an introduction to the Energy Workforce Equity Portal, which is an online tool or resource that the IPA launched at the end of January, just a couple months ago. We'll also discuss the availability of a waiver of the minimum equity standard, what that looks like, and then we'll provide a few more details of timeline and again, some time at the end to answer any questions. So for anyone who has trickled in the last couple of minutes, a reminder to please keep yourself on mute, put any questions in the chat and we'll have time for those at the end. And that this is being recorded and you can access it afterwards as well. Next slide. So this is also just a reminder of the scope. This is a presentation intended for utility scale rec suppliers. So if anyone who has joined us is more interested in how the equity requirements apply to Illinois Shines, we have other presentations available on both the IPA and the ABP websites, particularly one that was that occurred just this past March 13th that has information specific to the Illinois Shines program. We will not be talking about Illinois Shines today. Next slide. Great, so I'm going to pass this over to Anthony and he's going to give a broad overview of the equity framework and how it will apply to utility scale developers.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So I'm Anthony Starr. I'm the Senior Advisor and Interim Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief at the Illinois Power Agency. So the reason we're here today is to talk about the Equity Accountability System, which is a critical component of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that passed a couple of years ago. And it's a creation that was designed to ensure that as the clean energy economy in Illinois develops, that we do so in a way that brings opportunities across the spectrum of businesses and individuals who have not always participated in the energy sector previously. So as you can see on the slide, we have some of the language from the law that sort of frames what the goal here is. So what does the equity accountability system include? It's really got several different pillars to it. First, and outside the scope of what we're talking about today, is within the adjustable block program, which is our program to support distributed generation solar and community solar. There's a specific category now for projects from what are known as equity eligible contractors, and I'll be talking a little bit about them later. Then we also have minimum equity standards that apply across both the adjustable block program and, as Sarah described, our index direct procurements for utility scale wind, utility scale solar, and brownfield site solar projects. And that's what we'll be sort of really going into, is what those standards are and how entities can comply with them. We also have a provision within our competitive procurements for index recs for prioritization of bids from entities that have an increased percentage of, if they go above and beyond the minimum equity standards. That's a little beyond what we're talking about today, but we will be touching on that a bit. What the law set out for us was a starting goal that will build over time. So we're starting with a goal of 10% of the workforce in 2023, and we'll define what we mean by these terms and timeframes shortly. But the 10% of the workforce will come from equity eligible contractors, equity eligible persons, and that will grow over time to a goal of 30% by 2030. Again, this is a way to really ensure maximum inclusion in the clean energy economy. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit more to go into more details on this. The first is the one thing that I mentioned briefly, that when in competitive procurements, we do prioritize bids from equity eligible contractors or those people who are using them in the procurements. So that's one thing. The second aspect of it is that this now applies to our utility scale procurements. The way things at the Illinois Power Agency work is we obviously start with legislation that's passed that enables the IPA to do, whether it's electricity procurement or our programs and procurements around what is known as our 2022, our long-term renewable resources procurement plan, is a plan that sort of lays out the details of the concepts that are in the law and really puts them into action. The current plan is our 2022 long-term plan that was approved last August, where we brought the concepts that were in the IPA Act that were added through CEJA and sort of put them into practice. So for utility scale procurements, there's a requirement that bidders commit to meeting a minimum equity standard. We also have a provision that if a bidder is an equity eligible contractor, that actually brings them into full compliance with the minimum equity standard. Then, and I think probably great interest to the participants in today's session, that successful bidders have to submit compliance plans that describe how they're going to meet the equity standards, as well as ongoing sort of documentation on how they're doing for meeting it. So one of the goals of today's workshop is to sort of begin to talk through how this will work. We're going into the first year of operation, so this is sort of our learning year, and I think everyone is very curious to sort of see what this looks like in practice. We also have this provision that in competitive procurements, because they're based upon the price a bidder submits for their strike price, that the evaluation process does account for bidders who have a higher value of their contracts going to an equity eligible person or an equity eligible contractor above and beyond whatever the minimum standard is. That doesn't change the ultimate strike price, but it does change the evaluation process. And as coming months, as there's more information on our next utility scale procurement, there'll be more information in the workshops and rules around those procurements on how that actually works in practice. Next slide, please. So the minimum equity standard is based upon the idea of what percentage of a project's workforce consists of equity eligible persons. So starting the first year of this program starts in the energy delivery year that starts June 2023. And the requirement is 10% of the project workforce must be equity eligible persons. We plan that in our long-term plan that I referenced, that will be increasing to 12% for the following year. And then this summer, we'll be releasing a next version of the long-term plan that will get approved next February of 2024, and then that would propose the standards for the subsequent 2 years, and then that will continue on a rolling basis. So for utility scale projects, the requirement is that the minimum equity standard is based upon the time in which the project was bid. So it's not that if it takes several years for you to get to construction, you would be held to a minimum equity standard that's at a higher level than at the time you bid, but it's really based upon that at the time you're bidding. So in essence, right now, the minimum equity standard would be 10% in the upcoming procurements. Next slide, please. So who's required to comply with this? If a project is selected in a procurement, it has to submit a compliance plan on how you plan to achieve the requirements of the minimum equity standard. We understand that there's delay, there can be there's timing issues around when you bid versus when a project actually starts construction. So one of our requirements is that you have to start it by the program year in which the construction activity is going to be occurring for the plan. So it takes into account development time. There's a mid-year report due to track progress, and then at the end of each year, you'll be submitting a compliance report that will include documentation of what you did during that year. As Sarah alluded to earlier, there is also a waiver process in place that allows, in rare circumstances, if it's not possible to find the equity eligible workforce that the standard requires, that you can request waivers of it if you've properly documented the efforts to try to comply that have not been successful. Next slide, please. So I've thrown out a number of terms. Now I want to sort of drill down a little bit in terms of what they mean. These are terms that are defined in the Illinois Power Agency Act. These were added to the Illinois Power Agency Act through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. And these are new concepts that we are now bringing into implementation. The first concept is that of an equity eligible person. An equity eligible person can be considered that through one of 4 different criteria. The first is someone who's participated in certain job training programs that were established either through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act or some, but not all, of the job training programs created by the previous energy legislation in Illinois, the Future Energy Jobs Act. The second is someone who is a graduate or currently enrolled in the foster care system. The third is someone who is formerly incarcerated. And then the fourth is someone who lives in what is known as an equity eligible investment community. So what is an equity eligible investment community? It is either a community that the IPA has defined as an environmental justice community through our Illinois Solar for All program, or what's known as an R3 community, which is a series of communities across the state that were included in the cannabis legalization as priority areas for investment and consideration. The overlap between those two maps is actually very substantial, and we'll be showing a little bit about that a little later in the presentation. But one concept that I really want to emphasize here is that when we developed the environmental justice map that we use for the Illinois Solar for All program, our low-income solar program, we did it by a research project of looking at various environmental and equity impacts on every single census tract in the state, and then taking the 25% of census tracts that had the highest scores in that process and defining those as environmental justice communities. So what this means is that a quarter of the state is considered environmental justice communities. And while the population from census tract to census tract can vary, roughly speaking, that means that roughly a quarter of the population of the state would live in an equity eligible investment community. So as you think about where are equity eligible persons, do keep in mind that while those are not evenly distributed across the state, there tend to be more in high population areas, in areas where there's been more of a legacy of environmental impacts on communities, that there is a substantial portion of the state for which you could find people who are equity eligible persons. You may already have many employees who already live in these communities. We also have the concept of equity eligible contractor. And an equity eligible contractor is basically a business that's majority owned by equity eligible persons. It can also be a nonprofit that's majority governed, or if you have a basic, small business and independent contractor that's run by an equity eligible person, that would also count as an equity eligible contractor. Next slide, please. The project workforce. So who is it? It's defined. We've defined it as employees of the company, contractors and their employees, and their subcontractors and employees. So you can look down your value chain of who would be considered the workforce for the project. And these are for people who are in roles such as development, construction, operations, and administration and sales and marketing. However, we do want to emphasize that for the purposes of this compliance, only work that's performed in Illinois is relevant, regardless of where the worker lives. So if you have someone who lives just across the border, but is working on a day-to-day basis in Illinois, that would count. On the other hand, if you have some of these functions that are taking place in an office in another state, that would not qualify. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a bit of a visual of how this will work, that we have, so we'll have an annual cycle starting with the 2023-2024 program year, where we have an initial deadline for submitting a compliance plan. The IPA will then review those plans and score them on a scale in terms of whether they're insufficient, if they're acceptable, but then we also want to highlight where we have entities that are going above and beyond that we really want to call out and praise those. So we have a scoring system that defines that. We'll have a process of, if there's stuff we need additional information from an entity on their plan to sort of provide that additional information, and we may require corrective action plans if plans submitted are not sufficient. We'll have a mid-year check-in at the end of, and then at the end of the year, submitting a compliance plan of how you did that year, and then this cycle repeats again. Next slide, please. With that, I will turn it back to Sarah to sort of go into some of the details of how MES compliance will operate.
Thanks, Anthony. So, as Anthony explained, kind of the key initial requirement for implementing the minimum equity standard is this compliance plan. So essentially, the compliance plan is meant as a vehicle to prompt entities required to comply. So in this context, developers holding a REC contract to plan ahead, to really do the work to build that pipeline, hire people ahead of time, and kind of have the strategy to get to the equity standard before construction begins. So we have mirrored the timeline for the compliance plans in Illinois Shines as well, to provide some consistency and also predictability for developers. So compliance plans will be due at the beginning of the program year, which is June 1st. So the first compliance plans will be due by June 1st of this year, but they are due during years in which construction activity on the project occurs. These plans are meant to provide details on how the entity plans to meet the minimum equity standard in that delivery year during which construction activity happens. And again, as we mentioned earlier, the applicable minimum equity standard for a project will be the standard that was in place when the bid was accepted and the REC contract was awarded. So for projects selected through the upcoming procurement, that minimum equity standard will be 10%. Even if construction doesn't start for 2 years, and by that point, the agency has increased the minimum equity standard, in order to provide certainty and allow for planning, we are requiring the percentage that was in place at the time of the procurement. There is room for adjustment of compliance plans if the agency in its review or the procurement administrator in its review finds that there are some deficiencies. So we will allow for amendments and corrections. Next slide, please. So the compliance plan should include at least the following elements. You know, a commitment to comply with the requirements for the minimum equity standard, a narrative description of how the entity plans to meet that commitment. We are also looking for a projection of the number of workers that will be included in the workforce, and if possible, a demographic breakdown of the current workforce, so that we have kind of that demographic view into the people being employed through the Illinois clean energy sector. If there are any plans for use of equity eligible contractors, which Anthony mentioned, are entities, either a single person serving as an individual contractor or a company that is majority owned by equity eligible persons. Whether the entity holding the REC contract qualifies as any disadvantaged business enterprise, what the communication plans will be for recruiting equity eligible persons, and whether there has been any updates or corrections or adjustments from previous plans. Next slide, please. So we will be providing an online form, a virtual form for submission of these plans. So really the only thing that will be kind of free form or might require an attachment would be those narrative explanations and the communication plan. This will be on the procurement bidder portal. We are very close to having that finalized, so that should be done this month, and then be open for submissions. Again, plans are due by June 1st if there are development or, I'm sorry, construction activities in this upcoming year. Next slide. So we will be assessing the compliance plans on just a really simple 1, 2, 3 scale. If we don't see enough detail, if there are missing sections, or if you know, the seller has failed to complete it, we're going to provide a rating of 1, and at that point we would go back to the seller to request amendments or corrections. A rating of 2 and 3 will result in approval of the compliance plan. Rating of 3 indicates that the entity has chosen to go beyond the minimum equity standard, and that is what is required if they have received that bid adjustment downward in response to committing to that higher level of employing equity eligible persons and contractors in their workforce. Next slide. So potential reasons why we might find that a plan needs development. If the narrative description is extremely vague, just kind of general statements about we will hire people or we will develop a strategy to meet the standard, is really not going to be sufficient. We need more information on planning. This is supposed to be an exercise to kind of help entities think ahead and really do their best to make sure that they have put in the efforts, even if they don't end up meeting that standard, because if you need a waiver, as we'll talk about later, we are going to require showing that that good faith effort has been put in. We also are looking for demographic information if possible. If you are not able to provide that information because people are declining to give it, that's acceptable. But what we don't want is to people to just leave that completely blank or not provide the number of workers in their workforce. Again, as I said, there is opportunity to provide corrections. You have about a month after we notify you of deficiencies to provide an updated plan. Next slide. Okay, so just to dig into this a little bit deeper, so this is kind of an example of something that we would not really find sufficient. So in the first one, where we're asking for a narrative description, it's a single sentence, and it basically just says, we'll do our best and we'll post some jobs. In the communication outreach plan, it has two things listed and doesn't really go into a ton of detail about who these community-based organizations are or anything like that. On the demographic workforce information, it looks like there was a lot left blank. I think actually this might be the wrong image, but it's supposed to be if your projected total number of employees was 10 and you didn't report any demographic information, then that would be incomplete. Next, please. Okay, so the narrative description here should be a little bit more fleshed out. Like here you are saying that you're going to survey all of your current employees to figure out whether they qualify as EEPs, and then you would list the local organizations that you're going to use to promote open and applicable positions. The communication plan has a lot more detail. It lists timelines and identifies specific events and platforms that they're going to use. And then there's just more demographic information presented on the current workforce. Next slide, please. So as I went into, the compliance plan is meant to be kind of a vehicle to ensure that entities are planning appropriately, but you know, the real requirement is actually meeting the minimum equity standard. So at the end of each year in which construction activities occur, the rec contract holder should submit a report showing what the actual performance of the project workforce was when it comes to including equity eligible persons. So this is where you're verifying that you have actually met the standard. You can also provide any updates on differences as to how you met that standard and whether you were able to go beyond the actual 10% or whatever the applicable level is. These are due each year. So if your construction activities span multiple years, we are asking that this report gets submitted for each year, as well as a compliance plan for each year. The thinking behind that is that there might be shifts in your workforce, and we want entities to be continually working towards getting into compliance with the MES, even if perhaps in the first year of construction, it's not possible. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it back to Anthony. He's going to go over one of the resources that we have available for entities as a tool to support compliance.
Thank you, Sarah. Next slide, please. So the Energy Workforce Equity Database is one of the components that was included in CEJA for the Illinois Power Agency to develop. And we launched it earlier this year and we're calling it our Energy Workforce Equity Portal, because it really is more of a portal than a database. It's a website that has access to a number of different resources, some of which could be construed as a database, but it's more than just that. Okay, so what can you do on the Energy Workforce Equity Portal? To start with, this is just the beginning of it. We have plans over the coming year to expand and bring in more information. The Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity is busy developing their workforce training programs. As those come online, the portal will include more information on those. It will also be a resource for reporting on information about the status of the work done both by the IPA and DCO on promoting equity in the clean energy economy. Today, what you can do is really two things. One is that it's a place where someone can register to be listed in the portal and then see if they are qualify as an equity eligible person. There's a form that can be filled out to request the IPA review who you are and if you are an equity eligible person. One thing I want to be clear here is this is just one of the ways someone can be an equity eligible person. There's a certain simplicity in having someone listed here, but as part of the plans that Sarah was just describing, companies can undertake that verification themselves and attest to it themselves as part of their minimum equity standard compliance. Another aspect of the portal is a job board where clean energy developers can post jobs, and then those would be visible for someone who's equity eligible person can see that there's a company out there looking to hire equity eligible persons. And then also registered clean energy developers can search the listing of equity eligible persons on this website in order to so if they're looking for equity eligible persons, it's a way just to begin to connect job seekers with companies looking to hire people. Next slide, please. An important part of the tool too is the equity and investment eligible community map. What this map does is you can simply type in an address and hit enter, and it will tell you either that address is located in an equity investment eligible community or is not located in an equity investment eligible community. So this is a really convenient way to find out if you think you might be an equity eligible person by virtue of where you live. You could put your address in there, and that would then determine that. You could fill out the application or perhaps notify your employer. Likewise, an employer could use this to review their employees and their home addresses to see if they're equity eligible persons. So again, it's a very powerful tool to let you do those searches. We also have the underlying data available. So if you have a company that has your own mapping of capabilities, and rather than using this portal would want to do it in-house, we can provide those shape files, which are the documents that would allow you to that data that would allow you to basically create your own map and do the equivalent work internally. Next slide.
Okay, I think yeah, I'm gonna take on this section. So as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, the IPA Act does allow the IPA to grant waivers of the minimum equity standard in rare circumstances. We just went through a stakeholder feedback process on this, so some of you may be familiar with this process. From the outset, we just want to emphasize that this should be a last resort. We expect sellers to put in good faith due diligence to meet the minimum equity standard before seeking a waiver. We expect them to submit a compliance plan and do the mid-year check-in, even if ultimately they end up requesting a waiver. So in rare cases, they may request a waiver if it looks like they still are not going to meet the MES despite implementing a compliance plan and doing all of that due diligence. We will be accepting those requests on a rolling basis, so there won't be a specific time period in which you're only allowed to request them, and they are applicable for that that year. Next slide. So what we're looking for in the waiver is evidence that the requester has put in due diligence to meet the standards, and not just assumed that they're not going to be able to do it. So we have put out a final waiver request form already, and that right now is posted on the ABP site, but we will also be posting it on the IPA website. It's essentially the same. It will be, again, an online form, and you will be able to select kind of what type of procurement you're participating in. So the things that we're looking for kind of mirror what we looked for in the compliance plan with a few extra elements. So describing the efforts that you put in to work with job training and workforce development programs, whether you are kind of reserving applications of equity eligible persons that might be eligible for future openings, attendance at any events or job fairs, working with community-based organizations, reaching out to equity eligible contractors to see if they are available to work on the project, and kind of a variety of recruitment and kind of pipeline building activities. Next slide goes into a few more examples. So whether you are using various platforms to advertise opportunities, and also showing using state-run job posting platforms to advertise any opportunities. Additional things that are in the waiver include things like a catch-all for, efforts that didn't fit into any of the specific categories. We also have a point deduction for if there are kind of similarly situated entities that were able to meet the MES. That will be kind of a high bar to meet. So it's, particularly with utility scale projects that are pretty unique in nature in terms of location in the state, size, things like that. But we are required by law, it's within the IPA Act, that we must be looking at whether similarly situated entities were able to meet the MES in evaluating these waiver requests. Next slide. So what happens if you are unable to meet the MES? If you are unable to meet the MES and you are not provided a waiver because your request was deemed insufficient, there will be disciplinary consequences, essentially being suspended from the ability to submit bids into future procurements. And just a reminder that the waivers are for 1 year. So if you request a waiver for the first of a 3-year project construction, and we expect you to renew efforts and try to meet the MES for those second and third years. Next slide. So that's kind of a broad overview. If you can go to the next slide, we have a little bit of a timeline, additional timeline. So again, this has been kind of the process. We did some webinars for Illinois Shines over the fall. We did the development of the waiver process in the early months of this year, and now we're doing these trainings on submitting compliance plans and meeting the standard. So again, we'll have the compliance plan submission form and the waiver request submission form available in the next month or so. And the equity portal is up and available for folks as well. I think we can turn to questions now. I know some of them have already been answered in the chat, but it looks like there's one from Dawn. The MES requirement is measured against what workforce? Is it all hours on the project or just labor hours? And does the baseline include workers that work from other states? So Hannah, could you go back to the slide from the very beginning that kind of lists the project workforce scope? So the project workforce applies to individual persons. So it's not measured basically in construction work hours. So next one, I think it should be, yes. So it's actually based on number of employees, not the number of labor hours. And it applies to the entire kind of chain of contractors. It does apply to workers that work on a project in Illinois, even if those workers live in other states. The nexus of the work duties overlapping with location in Illinois is what is important. So if you have workers that are on a project site for several months in Illinois, even if they don't live in Illinois, those workers will count in the denominator of basically the denominator of the percentage of MES. So if you have your entire workforce in the denominator and then the number of equity eligible persons in the numerator, that is how we are going to determine compliance with the MES. This slide is kind of a simplification. We have a more detailed definition of project workforce, which if someone from the agency maybe can copy and paste that into the chat, that would be good. And it also does include kind of non-construction related roles, but because of the long timelines for development of utility scale projects, we're only requiring that the entity meet the MES for the years in which construction occurs. That's a little bit different from what we're doing in Illinois Shines, where we're also including, time periods where they're just doing sales and marketing. I think that's, and then it also will include kind of equity eligible contractors as well. So if you have an equity eligible contractor working on your project, you do need to count all of their employees in the project workforce. Let's see, it looks like we have a few other questions coming in, and also if that wasn't clear, please let me know. So it looks like Heather has a question on looking for MWBEs and other entities, or whether we're looking for equity eligible persons. So Hannah, if you could go to slide 15, it looks like she's looking specifically at that one. So we are asking for whether the entity qualifies as this category of minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, mainly to get a picture of the clean energy workforce and field in Illinois. But the minimum equity standard is purely based on whether there are equity eligible persons and contractors in the workforce. And equity eligible persons are those categories of graduates of workforce training program, returning citizens, foster care graduates, and primary residents of an equity investment eligible community. So there is not a minimum requirement for hiring or using MWBE contractors, but we want to collect that data in the compliance plan so we have a full picture of the market actors in Illinois. I hope that answered your question. Yes, we will be this slide presentation will be available for reference. Any other questions? Or do, Anthony, I don't know if you have anything else to add to any of the responses I gave.
No, you did a wonderful job.
Yes, contact information. I actually don't know that we included our emails on that slide at the beginning. So Hannah, can you go all the way to the end? I know that there's like a Q&A slide and I don't remember whether we included. No, we did not. Okay. So we'll drop, I mean, I'll just drop my email in the chat right now. So I have been kind of serving as the lead from the legal team on equity requirements. So if you have questions specifically pertaining to MES, I'm happy to answer them. I will also note that you know, this is the very beginning of implementing all of these requirements. We know that utility scale projects, just the process of development looks very different from the projects that we see in Illinois Shines. So we're still going to be learning as we go. And we, are looking for feedback on ways to make this work better for the industry. And, we're looking forward to seeing how this goes in these first couple of years of implementation. Okay, we still have 10 minutes, but it doesn't look like there are any other questions coming through the chat. I think our team is happy to stay on for another minute, but we also don't want to hold people up on a Friday. So unless there are more questions, we'll give it another minute or so, but thank you so much for joining us. Again, we'll post the recording for this on the IPA website and on the bidder portal. And oh, Heather, good question. I believe these will be submitted to the IPA. Anthony, do you remember? I believe we decided that we would be the ones reviewing the compliance plans.
That is correct. I believe we have an email address set up. If you go back to the index direct rules from the procurement, I believe there's a link to that, to where we want consent.
So we had to kind of, since this applied to the last procurement and we didn't have that the compliance plan kind of virtual format set up for the entities that participated in the last procurement, we had just asked that they send these via email. But once we have this online form up and available, we will accept it through that platform as well. But IPA will be the ones reviewing this, just because the procurement administrator is, you know, not as familiar with this area, and we do want to have a little bit closer hold over it, since it's, you know, a pretty important priority for the agency. William asked about access to the portal and notifications. If you're asking about the Energy Workforce Equity portal, we can actually, let me just drop the link in the chat. So it's a public website. If you want to post job opportunities to the website, to the portal for viewing by potentially equity eligible persons, there's a link there. You just fill out a Microsoft form or a Smartsheet form to verify a contact person, and register as a company, as a clean energy company, to use the portal. And then you can submit as many job applications as you would like. Let's see, if we have multiple rec awards, we submit one report for all annually or individual ones. That's a really good question. I think we'll actually have to get back to you on that. I don't think we had been kind of imagining for utility scale that there might be entities with multiple overlapping projects. So why I will take that back. In Illinois Shines, we are requesting a compliance plan per entity. So they would do a compliance plan and an end of year reward or end of year report for their entire portfolio of projects during that year. So we might do the same thing on the utility scale side. The waiver, however, would be project specific. So why don't we confirm that, and we can get back to you on that specific question. All right. If there are no other questions, thank you all so much for joining us. And please reach out with any other questions. We'll try to provide, you know, updates as we go, and have a lovely weekend.